So imagine you're doing your job,
Right.
right? And you do it so flawlessly that your work essentially becomes a cornerstone of global science.
Which is, the dream for any researcher.
Exactly. You publish your findings, they go through this rigorous peer review, and you essentially solve this massive puzzle that people have been wrestling with for decades.
Yeah.
So you'd expect, I don't know, a quiet life of academic accolades, right? Maybe some boring faculty dinners. But instead, you get hit with a multi-million-dollar smear campaign
Oh, yeah. Absolute nightmare.
organized by people completely outside your field, basically accusing you of scientific fraud in the middle of the world's biggest financial newspapers.
And, that is the paradox of Ben Santer. Because he was a MacArthur genius, right? A
Yeah.
truly brilliant atmospheric scientist working at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And the crazy thing is, he wasn't targeted because his science was weak.
Right.
He was targeted because his science was absolutely airtight. And that posed a massive existential threat to certain industries.
Which brings us to the mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring the book Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Erik M. Conway. And we're really, pulling apart the machinery of a very specific, incredibly effective public relations playbook.
It really is a machine.
It is. We are going to look at how a tiny, tiny group of highly credentialed scientists somehow managed to manufacture doubt and keep the public utterly confused on the consensus regarding, well, everything from the dangers of tobacco to Cold War missile defense to global warming.
But before we dig into the actual mechanisms of that machine,
Yeah.
I think we really need to lay down a crucial ground rule for this discussion.
Absolutely. So for you listening, we want to be incredibly transparent here. The historical sources we are unpacking today cover several decades of intensely polarized, politically charged issues.
Very charged.
Right. I mean, we're dealing with environmental regulations, national security policy, the actions of massive corporations. So we are stepping into this deep dive strictly as impartial analysts. We are not taking sides. We aren't endorsing any left-wing or right-wing political viewpoints. And we certainly aren't prescribing policy.
Right. Our goal is just to impart the factual history.
Exactly. We are simply dissecting the strategies exactly as they are laid out in the original source material.
Because really, we are dissecting the architecture of information warfare. We're looking at how public perception is engineered.
So let's start that dissection with Ben Santer's breakthrough. This was back in the mid-1990s. Santer was tasked with answering basically a definitive question, which was, is the warming of the Earth natural, or is it human-caused?
A huge undertaking.
Yeah, and he answered it by discovering what we now call climate fingerprinting. So, okay, let's unpack this. To understand why this was so revolutionary, we have to look at the basic mechanics of the atmosphere. Because if the sun were simply burning hotter,
Right.
like acting as a giant furnace heating the Earth,
Then basic physics dictates that the entire atmosphere would warm up uniformly.
right,
Like both the lower layer, which is the troposphere, and the upper layer, the stratosphere, would show a temperature increase.
but Santer's models showed something completely different. It's essentially, it's the difference between turning up the furnace in your house versus throwing a thick thermal blanket over yourself in bed.
I love that analogy.
Because if you turn up the furnace, the whole room gets warm. But if you use a blanket, you get warm, but the room outside the blanket actually gets colder, right? Because your body heat is completely trapped beneath the fabric.
Yeah, exactly.
And greenhouse gases act like that blanket.
Yeah.
So Santer proved that the troposphere was warming while the stratosphere above it was actually cooling. The boundary between those layers was physically shifting.
And it was just an undeniable, mathematically verifiable fingerprint of human activity. It became the absolute bedrock of the 1995 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report.
But the moment that report dropped,
Oh man, Santer was brutally attacked. Just a vicious op-ed published in the Wall Street Journal. They literally accused him of scientific cleansing, alleging that he, secretly altered documents to deceive policymakers.
which is just a career-destroying accusation, but the wildest part of the story is the identity of the attackers. Because it wasn't rival climatologists debating his atmospheric models.
Not at all.
It was a group led by two prominent retired physicists, Frederick Seitz and S. Fred Singer. And these men, they were titans of Cold War physics. They helped build the atomic bomb. They were actual rocket scientists linked to this Washington, D.C. think tank.
Yeah.
And when Santer tried to figure out, why are atomic physicists suddenly pretending to be experts in climate models, He uncovered the staggering historical connection.
What's fascinating here is that these same men were using the exact same playbook, and in some cases were the exact same people who defended the tobacco industry decades earlier.
Wait, okay, so how do retired atomic physicists end up getting involved in climate science by way of tobacco?
All right, the lineage of this strategy is just fascinating. To understand that, we basically have to trace the architecture of this doubt machine all the way back to its foundation in December 1953.
Oh, the Sloan Kettering Institute study.
Exactly. Researchers painted the skin of mice with cigarette tar, and it caused fatal, aggressive cancers. And the visual evidence was horrific,
Right.
and the media just ran with it. Reader's Digest published this massive piece called Cancer by the Carton.
I remember reading about that. The public panic was pretty much immediate, right?
Oh, total panic. The presidents of America's largest tobacco companies realized they were facing, well, an existential threat to their entire industry. So they held this emergency summit at the Plaza Hotel in New York.
As you do when you're a panicked executive.
Right. And they bring in John Hill, who's the founder of the powerful PR firm Hill and Knowlton. And Hill's assessment of the situation was a masterclass in, honestly, psychological manipulation.
Yeah, because he basically told them, don't try to prove smoking is safe.
Exactly. He told the executives that if they tried to claim smoking was safe, they'd be completely destroyed in the press. The scientific consensus was already forming against them. It was too late for that.
So instead, Hill proposes this massive paradigm shift. It's brilliant, really, in a dark way. He says, don't fight the science, fight the certainty.
Right.
They didn't need to prove cigarettes were harmless. They only needed to insist that there was, quote, no definitive proof that they were dangerous. They literally built their entire corporate defense around the mantra, doubt is our product.
Because you don't need to win the debate. You just need to create the illusion that a debate is still happening.
Yes. Let's break down the mechanism of how they actually did that, because it's much more sophisticated than just lying to the public. It reminds me of the concept of chaff used by military aircraft.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like when a fighter jet is targeted by a missile, it releases this massive cloud of shredded aluminum to confuse the radar, right? The tobacco industry basically funded academic chaff.
That is a great way to put it.
Because through R.J. Reynolds, they poured $45 million into biomedical research. They weren't trying to cure lung cancer. They were funding legitimate, highly credentialed scientists to study literally any alternative cause of illness.
Right. They handed out massive grants to prestigious universities, and they'd investigate, the role of nervous stress and disease, or the impact of genetic vulnerabilities, or even how urban smog affects the lungs.
Which, I mean, those are all entirely valid fields of study.
Completely valid.
But the strategic brilliance is in the application of it. By funding all this peripheral science, the tobacco industry basically built a stable of credible, university-backed experts.
Yeah.
So when a grieving family sued the industry, the corporate lawyers didn't have to put a slimy tobacco executive on the stand. They put a brilliant, geneticist on the stand who could point to their industry-funded research and say to a jury, well, we can't be 100% sure it was the cigarette.
Right. They'd say it could have been the man's stressful job or, his genetic predisposition.
And it completely paralyzes the jury.
It does. But, generating that alternative research is really only half the battle, because having fake or distracting research is totally useless unless you can force that manufactured uncertainty into the daily media diet of the American public.
Right.
And they accomplish that by hijacking the journalistic ethics of the era.
Okay, I want to push back on this a bit, or at least dig into it, because the book mentions they weaponized the Fairness Doctrine. Now, the FCC established the Fairness Doctrine back in 1949, and it required broadcasters to dedicate airtime to controversial issues in a balanced, equitable manner.
Exactly.
But the FCC only had jurisdiction over broadcast television and radio, right? Because they used public airwaves. Newspapers and magazines had absolutely no legal obligation to give equal time to anybody.
So how did the PR firms force print journalists to polish all this chaff?
Well, they leveraged the cultural weight of the Fairness Doctrine to weaponize the journalists' own professional pride against them.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because journalists pride themselves on objectivity, right? So the PR teams would aggressively lobby newspaper editors. They'd argue that if they only printed the findings of anti-tobacco scientists, they were basically abandoning their journalistic integrity.
That they were acting as biased activists.
Exactly. They demanded that any story mentioning the risks of smoking absolutely had to include a quote from the industry's research arm just to maintain, quote-unquote, balance.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you think about legendary journalists, right? How did they fall for this? Even Edward R. Murrow, who was arguably one of the most famously uncompromising journalists in American history, fell into this trap.
Oh, it's so true.
I mean, Murrow built his legacy standing up to Hitler and Joseph McCarthy. He famously refused to balance his coverage of World War II by giving equal time to the Nazis.
Right. He knew some things aren't a debate.
Exactly. Yet, when covering the tobacco controversy, he allowed his staff to present the issue with this stance of cold objectivity. He carefully weighed independent pathology against self-interested corporate PR.
And part of how they got away with that was the tactic of disingenuous questions. The PR teams would feed journalists incredibly specific, loaded questions that were designed to look like gaping holes in the scientific consensus.
Like cherry-picked data.
Yeah, they would urge reporters to ask things like, if smoking causes cancer, why do cancer rates vary so wildly between different cities that have the exact same smoking rates? Or, why is the spike in lung cancer happening mostly in men when the spike in cigarette sales was driven by women?
But the scientific community already had the answers to those questions.
Right.
Like the gender disparity, for instance, was simply about latency. Lung cancer takes decades to develop. Men had been mass smoking since World War I, whereas smoking really only became widely culturally acceptable for women much later.
Yeah, the latency periods were just staggered.
But the PR genius of it is that you don't actually care about the answer. The mere act of getting a respected newspaper to print the question creates the public perception that the scientists are baffled.
It creates a permanent state of suspended judgment.
Okay, so we've talked about the PR executives and the financial motives, but I want to stop for a second and look at the men actually executing the scientific side of this doubt machine. Men like Fred Seitz.
Yeah.
We're talking about a guy who was a former president of the National Academy of Sciences. He was a NATO science advisor. He wasn't a smuggling academic who needed a quick buck.
Definitely not.
So why does a man at the absolute pinnacle of human intellect spend his later years flying to Bermuda and doling out millions in tobacco grants just to confuse the public? What is the psychology there?
Well, the psychology of Fred Seitz is really the linchpin of this entire history. His motivations weren't really about the money. They were deeply ideological.
Really?
Yeah, rooted in the cultural fracturing of the 1960s. Seitz was a staunch patriot. He was a fierce anti-communist who believed deeply in the American military-industrial complex. And during the Vietnam War, he watched his fellow scientists basically turn against weapons programs.
Oh, right.
They started protesting the government and aligning with the emerging environmental movement.
So he viewed the scientific community's shift as, what, like a profound betrayal?
Exactly. He felt entirely alienated from his peers. Because to Seitz, technology, capitalism, unfettered private enterprise, these were the only things protecting the free world from Soviet totalitarianism.
Right.
So he viewed environmentalists not as protectors of nature, but as regressive Luddites who just wanted to dismantle the engine of American progress. And consequently, any attack on an American industry, even the tobacco industry, was fundamentally an attack on liberty itself.
Wow. And there is also this bizarre scientific blind spot that the book highlights with these guys. Seitz and several of his colleagues leaned heavily into the concept of genetic determinism.
Yes, like his predecessor, C.C. Little.
Right. They held this deeply philosophical belief that human frailties and diseases were dictated almost entirely by genetics, not by environmental factors.
And Seitz provides this perfect, honestly tragic example of this in his own memoirs. He wrote about a close colleague of his who died of emphysema in his 30s. Now, this colleague had spent his entire career working closely with beryllium.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Right. It's a highly toxic heavy metal that's essential to nuclear weapons development. And modern occupational medicine universally recognizes that inhaling beryllium dust just devastates lung tissue.
But Seitz refused to accept that the industrial byproduct killed his friend. He insisted that the early death was due to a latent genetic defect.
It's wild.
It perfectly encapsulates his worldview, doesn't it? Like, human industry is innocent, human biology is flawed.
Exactly.
And if you understand that deeply ingrained bias, that environmental regulation is a backdoor to socialism and that industry is always the victim, it makes perfect sense why Seitz and his cohort took their PR doubt machine straight into the Cold War.
It does. Knowing his extreme anti-communist stance explains exactly why they didn't stop at tobacco. That ideological drive led directly to the formation of Team B in 1976.
Okay, set the scene for Team B for us.
Yeah. So at the time, the political establishment was engaged in détente, right? Trying to ease nuclear tensions with the Soviet Union. And the CIA had produced these intelligence estimates, concluding that Soviet weapons accuracy was poor and that the United States maintained a pretty comfortable strategic superiority.
But the hardline conservative hawks absolutely hated that assessment.
Oh, they couldn't stand it. So they pressured the CIA to allow an independent, outside review of the classified data by a group of private policy hawks and physicists.
Which included Edward Teller, right, the
Yeah.
father of the hydrogen bomb.
Yes, this was Team B. They were essentially sent in to find the hidden Soviet threat.
So what does this all actually mean? What did they find to prove the CIA was underestimating the Soviets?
Well, let's look at what they didn't find, because their logic is just staggering.
Yeah.
The situation with submarine detection is the perfect case study here. Both American and Soviet navies relied on acoustic detection, listening for the sound of submarine engines. But both sides were also experimenting with non-acoustic detection methods. When Team B scoured the intelligence files, they found zero evidence that the Soviets had successfully developed or deployed a non-acoustic detection system.
Right. And in any normal scientific or intelligence framework, a total lack of evidence leads you to conclude the technology doesn't exist.
Exactly. But Team B flipped the scientific method upside down. They argued that the complete absence of evidence proved that the Soviet non-acoustic system was actually deployed, and it was so technologically advanced that it was perfectly invisible to American intelligence.
I'm sorry, that's hilarious. That's the invisible cat defense.
Right. It's an impossible argument to defeat.
You literally can't. The authors quote C.S. Lewis to describe this exact fallacy. The quote is, the very lack of evidence is less treated as evidence. The absence of smoke proves that the fire is very carefully hidden.
Exactly.
You cannot debate someone who claims the lack of proof. I.S. the proof.
No, you can't. But the terrifying thing is, this wasn't just an abstract philosophical debate. This invisible cat logic terrified policymakers. It helped derail peaceful coexistence and fueled a massive escalation in the arms race under Ronald Reagan.
Which brings us to Star Wars.
Yes, that escalation culminated in Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, widely known as Star Wars. The plan was basically to put a shield of laser-equipped satellites in space to shoot down incoming nuclear warheads.
Right, but mainstream physicists overwhelmingly viewed Star Wars as a completely destabilizing fantasy, a technological impossibility that would probably just provoke a Soviet first strike.
Exactly, but Seitz and his allies defended it viciously.
And the conflict reaches its absolute climax when they collide with Carl Sagan, because Sagan wasn't just, a popular television host, he was a heavyweight astronomer. He understood atmospheric dynamics better than almost anyone.
Oh, absolutely.
And Sagan and a team of researchers ran the math on a full-scale nuclear exchange. They discovered this terrifying concept of nuclear winter. They calculated a massive amounts of soot and ash that would be generated by burning Soviet and American cities.
Right, showing how it would rise into the stratosphere, blanket the entire Earth, and just block out the sun.
It proved mathematically that a nuclear war was unwinnable. Even if you had a Star Wars shield, even if you won the strike, the Earth would plunge into an apocalyptic freeze.
Wow.
Agriculture would collapse.
So how do you fight math that rigorous? Well, the doubtmongers knew they couldn't produce an alternative atmospheric model that showed the soot, magically disappearing.
Right.
So they deployed the tobacco playbook. Seitz, along with a prominent astrophysicist named Robert Jastrow, went on the offensive. They didn't attack the core physics, they attacked the parameters.
Just like asking about the cancer rates in different cities?
Yes. They demanded to know exactly how much soot would burn, exactly what the albedo effect of the smoke would be. They demanded a level of absolute 100% certainty that is fundamentally impossible in predictive modeling.
And they made it personal, didn't they?
Oh, very. They framed Sagan as a political activist who was just masking doomsaying as science. They used their own formidable credentials to muddy the waters in the media. They transformed a rigorously researched mathematical probability into this, quote, highly disputed fringe theory in the eyes of the public.
Wow. If we pull back and look at the grand architecture of everything we've discussed today, the mechanical through line is just chilling. I mean, from Ben Santer's temperature differentials to the cancer rates of smokers to Soviet submarine acoustics to the soot clouds of nuclear winter.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the underlying tactic never altered. Not once. You do not need to prove your opponent is wrong. You only need to weaponize the inherent skepticism of science against the public.
Right.
You keep the jury of public opinion permanently hung by fighting empirical facts with manufactured, heavily funded uncertainty.
Which means, for you listening, you really need to think about your own daily media diet.
Right.
Because when you see a debate on the news about a complex scientific issue, look critically at the screen. Ask yourself, are you watching two active, publishing experts in that specific, narrow field?
Usually you aren't.
Exactly. Or are you watching one expert being countered by a highly credentialed think tank scholar who is speaking leagues outside their actual discipline simply to fulfill a media quota for controversy? Being a genius in atomic physics doesn't grant you magical insight into oncology or atmospheric carbon data.
The credentials are often just part of the chaff.
Which leaves us with a complex, lingering thought to explore on your own, because science operates on the fundamental principle that nothing is ever 100% certain, right? Which is its greatest strength. It has
Hmm.
intellectual humility. We must always leave the door open for new data.
Exactly. That's how science works.
But if bad actors know this, and they actively weaponize that exact open-mindedness to paralyze public policy, we have a profound structural problem. It forces us to ask, in a modern attention economy that rewards conflict and amplifies doubt, is the traditional scientific method of quiet, closed-door peer review fundamentally outmatched?
It's a scary thought.
It is. When we picture Ben Santer in his windowless office, believing that perfect data would be enough to speak the truth, we really have to wonder if the truth can survive on its own or if it will always require a PR firm to cut through the smoke.